Well, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all here this morning and to introduce this conference on the learning and teaching of Arabic in early modern Europe. It is most appropriate that such a conference should take place here, since Leiden was where, or is where, the teaching of Arabic in Europe really took off. This can be seen from the splendid exhibition that is currently on display in this museum, 400 Years of Arabic Studies in the Netherlands. I hope you've already seen this or will be looking at this exhibition. It documents the contributions of a succession of great Arabists at Leiden University, from Franciscus Rafflengius, Josephus Justus Scaliger, through the first official professor of Arabic, Thomas Erpenius, and then Jacobus Scholius, Levinus Warner, Adrian Reland, and the three sultans to bring us into the modern period. This conference, of course, has a wider remit than the exhibition, since we shall be considering the Arabic studies not only in the Netherlands, but also in Germany, with Johann Zeckendorf and Zwickau, Johann David Michaelis in Göttingen, and the situation in Rome, in early modern Spain, and early modern England. This conference has been made possible through the support of the Humanities in the European Research Area, HERA, and is indeed part of the project Encounters with the Orient in Early Modern European Scholarship. This project, which many of you know about so far, aims to document the scholarly European encounter with Oriental culture between 1500 and 1800, and its objectives can be classified under four headings. First, to see how Oriental languages were studied and learnt. Secondly, to study the different ways in which Western Christians interacted with Islam and the Oriental Church. Thirdly, to see how the Bible functioned as a place of cultural encounter between Europe and the Orient. And fourthly, to document the discovery of Arabic literature. I think there's a brochure around which explains in more detail exactly what the aims of this project are. What we are witnessing during this period, 1500 to 1800, is a period in which there's a transition from regarding the Orient as primarily a source for gaining knowledge about the origins of Christianity and the establishment of the true meaning of the Bible, to discovering the Orient as having a culture, or rather a wealth of different cultures of its own, which in turn set the culture of Western Europe in perspective. Hence, this project hopes to demonstrate that the early modern scholarly encounter with the Orient initiated and promoted a profound transformation of Christian Europe, its scriptural foundation, its values, and its identity. So much for HERA. We are also supported, we're very grateful for the support of the Stichting Joinbal and the publishers Brill. Joinbal was a member, or the last, I believe, of a family of famous Orientalists, and his Stiftung is specifically geared to providing funding for scholarship in Islam and Arabic studies. Brill has always been enormously supportive, especially through the agency of Moritz van Bogaert. Of course, we know there are the complementary projects which Brill is sponsoring, initiating, that of the pioneer Orientalists, the digitization of the manuscript collections of Scaliger, Rafflengius, and Gollius from the University Library here, and the publication of an online resource on Christian-Muslim relations, a bibliographical history from 1500 to 1900. Finally, I would like to thank very warmly the immediate organizers of this conference, Jan Loop in particular, who's been in charge of inviting and putting together and organizing the details of the conference, who has had the help of Lot Breuer here, the local help here. Without these two, the conference would never have taken place. Just before we start, I must just announce a couple of changes in the program of personnel rather than of the papers themselves. Martin Murso is not feeling very well this morning. He's here, but is not able to be physically with us. So Jan will be the chair for the first panel. And then Uti Merisalo is also not with us because of the strike of the Finn Air, which is very rare, but it was unfortunate that this should occur today or this weekend. So she has not been able to leave Jyväskylä. And so Richard van Leeuwen will chair the second panel. So without more ado, I shall hand over the word to Arnoud Vrolijk, who will give the first talk.
Thank you. Yeah, change places.
Sorry, I just wanted to say a few words and introducing Arnoud before we start. Arnoud, most of you know him, of course. He's the curator of the Oriental Manuscripts and Rare Books at the University Library Leiden, and a prolific author of books and articles on the history of Arabic studies, in particular Oriental studies, in Europe, in Leiden in particular, but with a wide range of topics. And his latest book will be introduced, it's a catalogue on his exhibition, which is now just these days appeared in the English translation, which he wrote together with Richard van Leeuwen, and it will be introduced this afternoon during the reception. And I think now I would like to hand over to you, Arnoud. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jan. I am also the guest curator of the exhibition Voortreffelijk en Waardig, Excellence and Dignity, on the history of Arabic studies in the Netherlands. The exhibition is very modest in scale, but it tries to cover a long-standing tradition in local Dutch scholarship. Because it is difficult to tell a story with a few dozen objects and captions, I am happy with the occasion offered to me today, and it will be my pleasure to tell you more about the cultural and social background of Arabic studies in Holland. But before I plunge into the history of Arabic scholarship, I will start with the events of recent years. In the summer of 2007, I received a visit from Richard van Leeuwen of the University of Amsterdam. Richard and I have known each other since 1981, when I arrived at Amsterdam as an MA student. For years, we have been making mutual offers we can't refuse to collaborate in projects that are sometimes of a scholarly nature and not so scholarly or not at all, with the main purpose of keeping ourselves busy and out of mischief. On this specific occasion, in 2007, Richard asked me if I would join him in a series of short articles on the history of Arabic studies in the Netherlands. It would not be much work if we shared the burden, and we would have several years to finish it. In 2013, Sir Richard informed me, it would be 400 years since Thomas Erpenius became the first professor of Arabic in the Netherlands, and 2013 would be an excellent target. I rejected the proposal out of hand. In the complex bureaucracy of my university, research is not part of what they call my job description, and I am not accountable for it. This means that whatever research I do is done in my spare time. But my spare time is limited, and at that moment I was spending my evenings finishing a festschrift for my professor and supervisor of my doctoral thesis, Remke Kruk, who is with us here today. Thank you. So between 2008 and 2011, 10 portraits of Dutch, or rather Leiden, Arabists actually appeared in Zemzem, the only Dutch-language journal of Middle Eastern studies. Evidently, the course of events does not say much for my ability to say no and stick to it. This is an image of this journal, Zemzem. For this special occasion, Richard and I have re-edited these portraits with corrections and additions. And until March 2014, the National Museum of Antiquities, RMO, Rijksmuseum van Oudheden, will be the venue of the exhibition on Arabic studies in the Netherlands. And for this, we have to thank Wim Weiland, the director of the museum. And historically, RMO, the museum, has always concentrated on classical antiquity, the prehistory and early history of the Netherlands, and more importantly in this respect, on the ancient Near East. See, for instance, the recently reopened Near Eastern department on the first floor. Wim Weiland, the director, however, considers it important to show to the general public that the Near East is just as relevant for the culture of mankind today as it was in the distant past. In this policy, he has got the support of his wife, Mirjam Hoiting, who teaches museum studies at the University of Amsterdam, and she has strongly exerted herself in past years to promote the cause of Islamic art and its presentation to the public. And in the initial phase of the exhibition, I have enjoyed the support of my fellow Arabist Charlotte Huygens, who until recently worked in this museum. And I've also had the support of lots of other colleagues from this museum, Leonie van Esser, Cassandra Carmio, Rita van Oosterhout, and all their colleagues. And I found this cooperation extremely agreeable. But why choose the National Museum of Antiquities as a venue for an exhibition on Arabic studies? This calls for an explanation. It is common knowledge here in Leiden that RMO, officially founded in 1818, started out with the Egyptological collection of the University of Leiden. That creates a link in itself, but there is more. In 1619, the young merchant David Leleu de Willem traveled to Egypt as part of his grand tour. There he acquired Egyptian antiquities, not only smaller objects such as shaptis and canopes, but also a large mummy. After his return, he donated these objects to the Cabinet of Curiosities at the university, which was part of the anatomical theatre. On an engraving from 1712, the lid of the sarcophagus, there it is, can clearly be seen. It stands on end on top of a cupboard in the far right corner. Most of the Egyptian antiquities of de Willem were transferred to the newly founded museum in 1821, and the sarcophagus followed in 1872. De Willem followed a career in the Levant, where he was active in the textile trade. In 1629, he returned to the Dutch Republic, where he held high positions in the bureaucracy in The Hague. He never returned to the Middle East, but he did not forget his past career. He gave financial support to young scholars who wanted to travel to the Middle East, such as the German student Levinus Warner, who studied Oriental languages in Leiden under Jacobus Golius. In December 1644, he left for Istanbul with a travel grant from de Willem. Warner lived in Istanbul for 20 years and built up an important private collection of about 1,000 Oriental manuscripts. Warner never returned to Western Europe. He died in Istanbul in 1665, leaving his manuscript collection to Leiden University, where he had once been a student. Thus, de Willem was instrumental in the early collections of both the university and the Museum of Antiquities. But even if the museum wanted to give me the opportunity to organize an exhibition on Arabic studies, it has no collections on the subject at all. In a case like this, one can only turn to Leiden University with its beautiful portrait collection of Leiden professors in the Academy building and its world-famous Oriental collections. Leiden University Libraries, plural, it used to be singular, but now it's plural, where I work as a curator, has given me a free hand to organize an exhibition which consists almost exclusively of objects from the university collections. In doing so, I have profited from the official policy of librarian Kurt de Belder, who is exceptionally keen on collaborating with museums in Leiden and beyond to bring the special collections to the attention of the general public. Besides, the exhibition displays a splendid object on loan from the Museum of Johannes Enschede of Haarlem, the well-known banknote and passport printer. Thanks to the effort of curator Johan de Zoete, ever more people discover that Johan Enschede has a beautiful museum of typography. It must also be the best protected museum in the world, with safety measures I am not at liberty to describe here. 400 years of Arabic studies at Leiden is now being celebrated with great pomp and circumstance. Whatever you think of it, 400 years is a very long time, especially if you know that the university itself is not much older than that. This calls for a celebration, just like the diamond wedding of your grandparents. But just as in the case of weddings, people put on a smile and they are exceedingly satisfied with themselves and the world at large. In the case of scholarship, however, one should go further than self-congratulation and the magical world of PR and communication. For my fellow author, Richard van Leeuwen, and myself, this is the end of a project, but also a fitting moment for reflection. What makes Arabic so special? The first answer is that it is a language that has been taught almost continuously at Leiden University for 4 centuries. The same can only be said for the classical languages Latin and Greek and Biblical Hebrew. Dutch made its first appearance only in the late 18th century, and modern languages such as English, French, and German only followed suit in the 19th century. However, the classical languages and Biblical Hebrew were all dead, with the possible exception of Latin, which was of course used as a means of scholarly communication. Also, Latin, Greek, and Hebrew were regarded as the pillars of our own culture and religion. Arabic, on the other hand, was not only a living language, but also the vehicle of an alien culture. What's this? What do I do? Thank you. An alien culture that was very much alive and literally exotic and often hostile. And because it has been going on for so long, 400 years of Arabic studies provide an enormous amount of information on how Dutch scholars observe and study a culture that is not their own. And in spite of the impressive achievements of individual scholars, the results are not unequivocally positive. The first thing that strikes you when you look at Dutch or Leiden Arabists is that they generally follow the stream of Western scholarship. In the days of humanism, they were humanists. During the Enlightenment, they were enlightened. And in the age of imperialism, they were imperialists, and so on. Evidently, their scholarly observations did not change their outlook or methodology or cause them to go against the flow. Of much more importance is the fact that Arabic studies in the Netherlands have always had a strongly apologetic character, not only vis-à-vis the Arab world or Islam, but also with regard to the home front. Arabic always had to be accounted for. Whenever a student says that he studies Arabic, the question will always be why, now as well as then. And no one will ever say that to a student of English. Society has always put a price on the study of Arabic, which was called utilitas in the 17th century and in modern times social impact. You will find the arguments mainly in the inaugural addresses of the professors. They are about combating Islam with the force of arguments, converting Muslims to Protestant Christianity, or the use of Arabic, a Semitic language, as an aid for learning Hebrew, which led to the nickname of Arabic as the handmaiden of theology. The demand for Arabic exact sciences, such as astronomy, medicine, or mathematics, slackened after the 17th century because the gap between the two scientific traditions had been bridged by then. The social impact of Arabic studies is, of course, very much apparent in the economic relations between the Netherlands and the Islamic world. In 1612, Sultan Ahmed III of the Ottoman Empire concluded a peace treaty and a treaty of peace and friendship with the Dutch Republic. The Dutch obtained the right to trade with the Ottoman Empire under very favorable conditions. The interests at stake were very large, amounting to millions of guilders. It concerned the import of luxury goods, but mainly textiles. I've already mentioned the example of David de Willem as a merchant, statesman, and patron of Oriental scholarship. In the late 16th century, the Dutch also gained access to Southeast Asia, a rich source of spices which were sold in Holland at an enormous profit. Understandably, the Dutch mercantile aristocracy was relatively uninterested in stressing the theological differences between believers and infidels. It was about making money. The intellectual stronghold of the same business elite was the University of Leiden, founded in 1575. In this light, it is hardly surprising that at a very early stage, efforts were undertaken to give Arabic a place on the curriculum with a keen eye on business interests. The governors of the university, all of them politicians and merchants, were well aware that Arabic served as the lingua franca of the Muslim world. In August 1599, they granted permission to a certain Philippus Ferdinandus, a Jewish convert from Poland, to teach Arabic for a trial period with the explicit argument that it would be useful for the East Asian trade. And the gentlemen of the board assumed that the Arabic tongue is much used in those parts. In the 17th century, the symbiosis between economy, politics, and Arabic studies emerges in the person of Jacobus Golius. Golius, whose father was a high-ranking official in the Council of State, Raad van State, in The Hague, took advantage of the newly created diplomatic network of the Dutch Republic in the 1620s and traveled to Morocco on a diplomatic mission and afterwards to the Ottoman Empire, where he stayed in Aleppo and in Istanbul. The 18th and first half of the 19th century were, as far as Holland is concerned, a period of economic and political decline. But this changed for the better in the era of imperialism. As an example, I will mention Michael Jan de Goeje, who died in 1909, who is mainly known as the driving force behind the text edition of the Annals of At-Tabari, the largest Arabic text edition ever to have appeared in print in the Western world, and published by Brill. But in 1866, 8 years after the discovery of the sources of the Nile by John Hanning Speke, even a good-natured philologist like de Goeje caught the spirit of imperialism and the role that ancient Arabic geographical texts might play in the exploration and colonization of darkest Africa. And I cite, "Is it still necessary to illustrate what those books have to teach us, or how the knowledge which the Arabs have gained about North Africa, the Sahara, and the land of the Negroes has always been, and still is, of use for European travelers? Of what assistance the experience of the Arabs could be if Europe wanted to carry its civilizing influence deep into Asia and Africa?" The social relevance of Arabic, however, finds its culmination in the person of the controversial Arabist and Islam scholar Christiaan Snoucker-Gonje, who, after having traveled to Mecca in 1884-1885, became an advisor on indigenous and Muslim affairs in the Dutch East Indies. In 1906, he became professor of Arabic in Leiden, and according to Snoucker-Gonje, social impact was the raison d'être of Arabic studies. He reduced Arabic to the status of an auxiliary science to Islamic studies, and Islamic studies to a tool for the ideological control of the Dutch East Indies. His inaugural address as professor of Arabic in 1907 explains this in no uncertain terms. And I quote, "The study of the Arabic language and of the spiritual life whose vehicle it has become is an important part of the study of human history. But on us Dutchmen, it has an even greater claim, since 30 million of our fellow subjects of the Queen of the Netherlands take part in their own way in this spiritual life." At the end of his address, he even expressed the hope that he should never forget that Arabic covered far more than only Islam. It is probably a unique instance in the history of universities of a professor who, on the threshold of his assignment, hopes that he will not forget to do his job, which is precisely what he did. After the Second World War and Indonesian independence, the winds changed. In an era of unprecedented economic prosperity and intellectual freedom, scholars started to pay serious attention to Arabic language and culture. And suddenly the question became relevant if the Arabs had written any good books, or composed beautiful music, or produced fine art. In addition to the traditional stronghold of Leiden, everywhere in the Netherlands chairs of Arabic were founded, where Arabs who adhere to Islam were no longer reduced to a homo Islamicus, a kind of native whose actions are completely controlled by the precepts of Islam. As protagonists in Leiden, I will mention Jan Brugman, who studied modern Egyptian literature, or his successor Remke Kreuk, who was in for everything, the transmission of Greek science into Arabic culture, popular epics, magic, medieval botany, and zoology. But now, in 2013, playtime is over. The pressure of government spending cuts is enormous in this field of humanities that has always been extremely dependent on public money. Add to this the events of 9/11, and you will understand why most of these Arabic chairs have been discontinued or merged with religious studies, which has turned Arabic into the handmaiden of theology again. Of course, I understand that the government is reluctant to spend tax money on a professor who researches modern Egyptian dialects, while the whole Arab world is in turmoil. But I think the pressure of the here and now and the economic imperative blur our view of Arab culture and of the Muslim as a human being. And you also run the risk of losing touch with scholarship in the Arab world itself, where there is an avid interest in the tradition of poetry, art, manuscripts, and the like, even in the current period of adversity. At this very moment, Leiden is the only place where there is still a chair of Arabic language and culture. That is not only good and important, but it also creates obligations. But even at this university, the Islamization of scholarship and the pressure of social relevance and social impact cannot be avoided. At the anniversary of the university last February, 2 honorary doctorates were awarded on the occasion of the 4th centenary of Arabic studies to historians of early Islam, rather than a specialist in the field of language or literature, let alone art, philosophy, or even cookery. And the symbolic value is obvious. And the same conditions of social impact apply when you look for funding. I quite naturally turned to the largest grant-giving body of the university, the Leiden University Fund, LUF. However, my application was flatly rejected with the argument that it had no social impact. This is ironical because LUF has its premises in the former home of Snooker Gornje on Rapenburg 61, across the canal. For all practical purposes, that means that the spirit of Snooker Gornje is still abroad in his rambling patrician mansion. I know this is a bit of gossip, but I could not resist it. Yet, it would not do to characterize the Dutch Arabists as mere pawns in a play of economics and politics. They are, of course, much more than that. And because of their knowledge of Arabic, they have been able, in their own limited way, to communicate with people from the Orient, if not by going to the Middle East themselves, then at least by reading the written sources. And the important result is that their knowledge has led to a certain amount of tolerance and understanding. This relative understanding of the Orient becomes all the more apparent if you compare it with a dominant popular discourse on Arabs and Islam. As an example, I will use an anonymous treatise which appeared in Amsterdam in 1627 under the title, I will quote the title in English, History of the Origin, Descent, Birth, Education, and Teachings of the Great False Prophet Muhammad, etc. It is a handy survey of the ancient myths that have circulated in the West ever since the Middle Ages. I will not go into the origin of these stories, about which I know very little, but I will give some examples for those who are even less familiar with them than I. It is generally accepted in the Western popular discourse that the Prophet Muhammad was an epileptic who abused his fits to prove that he was receiving divine revelations. In the same manner, he fabricated miracles in order to fool the good people of Mecca. For example, Muhammad trains a white dove to pick grains of corn from his ears. In this way, it will look as if the Holy Ghost has descended on the Prophet to whisper God's word into his ear. It's a wonderful and very naive story that ignores the fact that the people of Mecca, being pagans, could not have known what the Holy Ghost was. Muhammad also trained an ox to eat from his hand and run to him whenever it heard him speak. And between the horns of the ox, Muhammad tied a copy of the Quran. And when he was preaching Islam among the people, the ox would push his way through the crowd with the Quran on his head. Another miracle. Again, this is an elementary mistake because both Orthodox Muslims and Western Orientalists agree that the Quran had not yet been codified in those days of the Prophet. And Muhammad even manages to continue his tricks after his death. He orders a metal coffin for himself, and in the church, as it is called, where he will be buried, he hides a number of very strong magnets in the dome. And after his death, his body is taken to the church, and lo and behold, the metal coffin rises to the ceiling, where it hangs suspended in the air. This is yet another miracle and another proof of Islam. According to this Dutch treatise, the credulity of the Meccans is caused by the devil. God has evidently turned his back on them. For if you enjoy God's mercy, you will immediately realize that this is a fraud. What I am trying to say is that the image of Muhammad as an impostor and a trickster is still a leitmotif in modern Dutch culture. The politician Geert Wilders uses it quite frequently in his speeches and publications. And if you Google the words Muhammad and epilepsy, you will get at least 500,000 hits. Compared with these stories, the Dutch Arabists don't perform badly at all in the course of history. A few decades before the publication of this anti-Islamic treatise, the young Dutch Arabist Thomas Eppenius was spending the summer of 1611 in Conflans, a village not far from Paris. There he was working in relative solitude on his grammar of the Arabic language, which would make him famous throughout Europe. In Conflans, an important Arab visitor called on him, the Spanish Muslim Morisco Ahmed bin Qasim al-Hajari. He had fled from Spain in 1599 and had made for Morocco, where he became secretary and interpreter to the Sultan. Gerard Wiegers knows all about him. He's devoted a lot of attention to this particular man here. In 1611, he traveled to Paris for diplomatic negotiations with the King of France. This was a windfall for Epiphanius, who had never met a native speaker of Arabic with a firm command of the classical language, and who had to derive all his knowledge from books. The Moorish scholar was sympathetic towards the young Dutchman and helped him with the fine points of Arabic grammar. It was inevitable that they would come to discuss their religions. Epiphanius, who had read the Quran and its commentaries, tried to prove that Christians were right and Muslims wrong. To his surprise, al-Hajari was not impressed, but countered his arguments with great flair, and irritated, but with an undertone of respect, Epiphanius wrote to a friend that the errors of the Muslims are not as easy to refute as one might think. In the summer of 1612, Epiphanius returned to Leiden, and a year later, in May 1613, he accepted his nomination as the first professor of Arabic in Leiden with his oration on the excellence and dignity of the Arabic language. In June 1613, when he was preparing his Arabic grammar for the press, he suddenly received a letter from the same Ahmed bin Qasim al-Hajari, who was in Amsterdam, waiting for a ship to take him back to Morocco. The Muslim scholar spent the whole summer in Leiden as a guest of Epiphanius and probably helped him again. And their exchange of ideas must therefore have led to a certain degree of friendship, or at least respect for their mutual opinions. And in 1627, the same year as the Dutch anti-Islam treatise I've mentioned, the Dutch Arabist Jacobus Golius was staying in Aleppo as a secretary of the local Dutch consul. As he had done before in Morocco, Golius got in touch with local scholars who could assist him in his quest for texts. If he could not get hold of the originals, he had them copied by local scholars or scribes, and one of them was a certain Darwish Ahmad ibn Hussam al-Gulshani, a dervish or brother of the Gulshaniya order of Sufis. For Golius, he copied the Arabic translation of the Konica, a text on conic sections by the Greek-speaking scholar Apollonius of Perga. The dervish could indeed write Arabic, but he was not able to tackle the mathematical drawings, and hence Golius added them himself in a somewhat unsteady hand. Like here. And in this manner, the manuscript we see here is a silent witness of the cooperation between a Dutch Arabist and a Muslim. An example from the early Enlightenment is the 18th century Arabist and Islam scholar Adriaan Reiland, professor of Oriental languages in Utrecht. In 1705, he published a book about Islam, De Religione Mohammedica, and in this book he debunks the medieval myths about Islam and calls for a more rational approach. He first points out that in the past it was always customary for religion to combat each other, and that this was frequently at the expense of the truth. The pagan Romans, for example, used to claim that the Christians worshipped a god with the head of a donkey, and they worshipped the genitals of their priests. And after their ceremonies, it was said by the pagan Romans, men and women consorted with each other in their hundreds. Similarly, Lutherans were suspected of spreading Muslim beliefs by the Catholics. And it is thus obvious that this sort of illusion should raise its head whenever another religion is being discussed, and that prejudices and misconceptions should often exceed the bounds of decency. Also in his foreword, Reiland says that he wants to describe the Mohammedan religion as it really is, free of the many misconceptions which prevail in Europe. He realizes that he is thus exposing himself to the criticism that he is too benevolent in his approach to the Muslims. Nevertheless, the truth, wherever it is, must be sought out. In the case of a religion which is so widespread, it is necessary to show it to anyone, not tarnished or covered with the fumes of calumny or errors, but as it is taught in the churches and schools of the Mohammedans. And Reiland hastens to add that such a reliable description is not intended as propaganda for Islam, but to make men better equipped to combat it. According to Reiland, the realization that Islam is an erroneous creed is no reason to regard the Muslims themselves as evil. Islam has retained many customs and principles which are comparable to Christian ones. And this alone should help us reject the idea that in Islam nothing is clean and everything is polluted. In Rayland's eyes, a knowledge of Arabic is indispensable for a sound understanding of Islam. Some people think that the study of Arabic is valueless, since Muslims are not prepared to discuss their religion, and since it is hardly worthwhile, so many say, to endure the distress of looking into the vanities and fanaticism of a madman or someone possessed. But, says Rayland, Mohammedans are not as mad or possessed as we should like to think. Sound understanding is distributed equally among mankind. A novel concept in those days, of course. And even if Islam is absurd, should we not look into it all the same? Indeed, it is even more important to gain an intimate knowledge of it. And according to Rayland, we do not have an adequate knowledge of Islam, and hitherto most polemicists did not combat the Mohammedan faith, but their own illusions and shadows. And Rayland concludes his foreword with the words, "It has never been my intention to praise the Mohammedan religion, which I curse, or to represent it as something better than it really is, and even less to be its advocate, or to claim that it is the truth. Far be it from me. Those who wish to pass such a verdict on me would do me a great injustice, and they would not be truthful. Since I wanted to write the truth, I have taken up the cause of the Mohammedans in many cases where they have been falsely accused. If people prefer to give credence to the unfounded lies that are told about the Turks, for example, that they are obtuse or asses or devils, instead of coming to my aid in refuting those lies, I shall have to bear it, for I notice more and more that the world wants to be deceived and to be ruled by prejudice." Yet, in Rayland's time, there was still a long way to go from a rational acceptance of Arabs and their religion to an emotional one. This would only happen in the late 18th century, in the era of early Romanticism. This was particularly late, for the general educated Dutch public had already embraced the image of the mysterious, exotic, and erotic Orient in the early 18th century, when the first translation appeared of the Arabian Nights. Indeed, Galland's French translation was published almost simultaneously with a pirated edition from The Hague. The first Dutch scholar who adopted the approach of the educated bourgeoisie was Hendrik Albert Schultens, the last scion of a dynasty which produced 3 successive generations of Arabic professors in Leiden. In 1772-73, he traveled to England, where he not only met David Garrick in his Theatre Royal, but also the British Orientalist William Jones, and Jones was to have a deep and lasting influence on Schultens. In 1776, Schultens delivered his Verhandeling over de Dichtkunde der Oosterlinge, Discourse on the Poetry of the Easterners, before the Amsterdam Society Concordia et Libertate. It must have been an appreciative audience, eager to be informed about all sorts of exotic matters. Schultens admired the Easterners for their common sense, genius, and good taste. It was above all the nomadic Arabs who had a great power of imagination and a great longing for freedom, the conditions for every good poet. According to Schultens, this was because of the climatic extremities, bare and burning deserts, hideous wildernesses, and arid sandy soil languishing with thirst. And he rejected the charge that Eastern poetry is characterized by an uneven style, fake ingenuity, and overblown rhetoric. The Westerner must first transfer himself into the natural condition of the Easterner before pronouncing himself. And the young Schultens quoted abundantly from an Arab love poem. In this courtyard, my Maya came to me, my Maya, whose brilliant sheen deadened that of the moon. Maya came to me, and we gave ourselves over to love. I saw cheeks which put the softest roses to shame. I saw a neck as white as lilies, as smooth as the most polished stones. Her jet black hair flowed over her shoulders. Her plaits were like palm clusters which, hanging from the trees, delighted our eyes. Her breast, her hands, her feet. The most modest of men can but be inflamed by the sight of such an extraordinary beauty. I plucked Maya by her enchanting plaits, and she came to me. I'll stop here. It is a very free translation, and the name Maya does not appear in the Arabic text at all. But that can hardly have mattered to the audience. So here we see how the Dutch scholar Schultens, a true romantic, gets carried away with the beauty of Arabic poetry. It is not only a romantic approach, but also a sentimental one, because Schultens never went to the Middle East, and he was never exposed to the barren climate, and he never saw an Arab at close quarters. And even the 19th century philologist Michael Jan de Goeje, who believed that Arabic geographical texts could be helpful in colonizing Africa, let himself be inspired by the Arabs and their culture, and he placed Islam next to Christianity and Judaism as the three noblest religions. And he was also genuinely moved by the beauty of Arabic poetry. The Arab people have produced masterpieces which are capable of bringing the strings which sounded in the poet's mind into movement in our breasts too. He also believed in the future of the Arab world. Over 60 years before the foundation of Saudi Arabia, he predicted that the Wahhabis in the Arabian Peninsula would found a kingdom on the ruins of the Ottoman Empire. According to him, North Africa would not remain forever the prey of foreign rule. Without actually mentioning him by name, he was directly contradicting the influential French Orientalist Ernest Renan, who in his Histoire générale et système comparé des langues sémitiques of 1854 had maintained that the world of Islam had no future. With these many examples, I hope I have proved my point that the Dutch Arabists, regardless of the pressure of social impact, have always tried to open their minds and sometimes also their hearts to the Arabs, their language, and their culture. I will finish my paper, there it is, with a few concluding remarks about the Hera project and what it has done for Richard van Leeuwen and myself. Honesty demands to say that the exhibition has only attracted funds from abroad. In the first place, this is Saudi Aramco, the national petroleum company of Saudi Arabia, who generously contributed to the general celebration of 400 years of Arabic in Leiden, but they also donated a modest amount to the exhibition. The largest grant, however, comes from the European project Encounters with the Orient in Early Modern European Scholarship, which is part of the academic partnership Humanities in the European Research Area. A rather complicated construction in the best European tradition. And this particular project is led and coordinated by Dr. Jan Loop and Professor Charles Burnett from the Warburg Institute. The Warburg Institute, I suppose not everyone is familiar with it. It was founded in 1921 in Germany by the Jewish art historian Abi Warburg. In 1933, shortly after the Nazis came to power, he moved his institute to London, where it has remained ever since. And in a few words, the Warburg studies the influence of ancient Mediterranean traditions on European culture from the Middle Ages to the present day. Jan Loop is an expert on the history of Oriental scholarship in early modern Europe, who has just finished his monograph on the 17th century Swiss Orientalist Johann Heinrich Hottinger, a student of Jacobus Golius. And Charles Burnett, of course, is a world-renowned expert on the transmission of knowledge between the Arab world and the West in the Middle Ages. And these two scholars have managed to obtain money from Brussels, which is rather special when you realize that only 18 projects have received a grant out of more than 500 applications. And I'm really very grateful for their efforts. And on September the 5th, Professor Burnett has opened the exhibition here in this museum. And now, a few remarks about the books. At the beginning of my paper, I've mentioned the short articles that Richard and I have written between 2008 and 2011 for the journal Zemzem. And now, as an accompaniment to the exhibition, we have reissued these articles enlarged with countless corrections. This would never have been possible without the financial support of Aramco and especially the Hera project. The Dutch version of the book has been published by the National Museum of Antiquities itself. And at the opening of the exhibition, the first copy was presented to Charles Burnett in recognition of his endeavors. And the elegant design was by Ontwerpwerk Design in The Hague, and they have managed to produce a very elegant book that aims especially at a local audience, hence the very modest price of €12.95. The English edition will be officially presented later this afternoon. It will be slightly more expensive than the Dutch one, so at least for once, there is something to be gained from knowing Dutch. Okay, I have come to the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to hearing the other papers.
Thank you very much, Arnoud, for this for this wonderful introduction to this symposium today. I think I would like to open. We have 15 minutes for or more, 20 minutes for discussions, and or less, however we want to. So we have maybe a bit more time to visit the exhibition. Are there questions, remarks from the audience? I mean, Leiden really has been an exceptional place for Arabic studies, and I think people like Johann Jakob Reiske was suffering under the fact that even in the 18th century Germany, you can only study Arabic if you would kind of put weight on its utility as a maiden to Hebrew studies, and people who would do that would really flourish, like Johann David Michaelis, but for Reiske it seems to have been very difficult to kind of make grounds. And yes, Casper. Sorry, can I? Yes. So for the.
I was wondering, what does Arabic studies in the Netherlands make itself special in comparison with Arabic studies in France, for instance, or England? Why does it stand out, or why is it special?
Well, this is closely related to the history of the Dutch Republic. As I said, the tide of Arabic scholarship follows the tide of the local economy. In the 17th century, the Dutch Republic was vigorous and very much oriented towards expansion. They were exploring Southeast Asia. They did a lot of trade with the Ottoman Empire, so there was really a big demand for knowing Arabic, and this was one of the main reasons for putting it on the curriculum. In the 18th century, when the Dutch Republic was languishing in economic and political terms, they withdrew to a very specialized field of Arabic related to theological studies, which proved to be not a very fertile subject for discussion for scholarly advancement. And in the 19th century, especially in the late 19th century, early 20th century, the knowledge of Arabic was closely related to the knowledge of Islam, and especially Islam in Southeast Asia, in the Dutch East Indies. So they really, and I think this was mainly the idea of Christiaan Snooker-Gornje, was an Arabist, and who wanted to cut out a place for himself in the political framework of Dutch society. So he claimed that you had to know Arabic before you could understand the Indonesians. Until that moment, it had been the general idea that Indonesians were basically Hindus and only superficial Muslims. And his main point that is that you cannot understand Indonesian Muslims unless you know more about Islam and know more about Arabic. And this gained him a permanent position in the colonial administration. So he really profited from his knowledge of Arabic. Sorry. So, yeah.
Yes, well, thank you very much for this very clear and elucidating presentation of a very long history of Arabic studies in the Netherlands. You spoke a little bit about the early history of Arabic studies in Leiden, in the Netherlands in particular, and talked a little bit about this Polish convert. No, yes, also, but that's not my question.
Okay, sorry.
My question is about, because I think, my question is about competition and other figures who were not successful in achieving to get these chairs. Arrhenius was successful, of course. But, and you spoke a little bit about Philippus Fernandez, but there were also others who I think should be taken into account and giving their place if we want to understand what Arabic studies amounted to also in the early period. It still is about competition. But I'm referring in particular to Jan Teunis, who was an Amsterdam Arabist, who was also very much involved, and his interest grew out of contacts with Muslim scholars. But he was not successful. No. And so I was just wondering, do these other persons not deserve to be taken into account if we want to understand the social impact, in your words, the social impact, but also in this time,
Yeah.
of Arabic studies. I mean, do we
Of
not need a
course.
sociology of knowledge also for Arabic studies in the Netherlands?
Yes,
to
of course,
understand?
Well, Richard and I do take him into account in our little book on Arabic studies, but it was basically a series of portraits of the people who actually made it. That is the big difference. Yes. But you're absolutely right, and I think Jan Teunis or Johannes Antonides, I think his main problem was his social background. He was, in contrast with Arpenius, who was very much allied to the elite of the Dutch Republic. Jan Teunis wasn't. And this may have been the main difference. I think he was a proficient Arabist. But even, I know, is it Weinmann wrote at least one large article on Jan Teunis. Two articles, you're right, yeah. And he casts it into the mold of this competition between somebody from the wrong social background and somebody who belonged to the elite. But if you face the real fact, I think you must admit that Arpenius was the better scholar of the two. Not that he came from the right social background, but he was also the better scholar of the two. This, of course, does not diminish the value of Jan Teunis' contribution to Arabic scholarship, of course not. But it's different. And he was also a Mennonite, I think. So he belonged to a religious minority, which made it even more difficult for him to gain access to the university or to get a position there. And especially after the Orthodox revolt in the Dutch university, shortly after the truce with the King of Spain. I think it was in 1619 or so. That was a difficult time when the university grew more orthodox than it had ever been. It had set out like a humanist experience, but after this Orthodox revolt, it really became a university for clergymen. But you're absolutely right, yeah.
Thank you very much. In a way, a continuation of the previous question. One of the things, it's not just about people who succeeded or not. I mean, there were very, very few professorships all over Europe for Arabic. So obviously, there were many more scholars of Arabic that did not succeed, not because of their own talents or social background, but because simply there were no jobs there. But one of the most fascinating things for me, certainly in the first half of the 17th century, is the element of ambition. I mean...
Sorry, I didn't quite get that.
The element of ambition. There
Yes,
is a new language made famous or popular primarily by Scaliger. And there is a whole generation or two of students who are determined to master it, no matter what the cost, no matter what the effort. And there is this funny letter from Claude Saumet Salmasius, who makes fun at Grotius, who doesn't know any Arabic, but he claims he does.
Yeah.
And, if we follow Derek's edition of the Scaliger correspondence, we have numerous references to Scaliger complaining bitterly about all those pretenders to knowledge compared to him, who really knows it, but he doesn't know much about it, and yet all those people who know nothing but pretend to know. So there is this element that suddenly Arabic is becoming...
It was cool
to
know Arabic.
It's becoming something that, a new fashion, that you have to show off that you can master it, which of course is very, very difficult. Everybody collects suddenly manuscripts or books, even if they don't know the language, but it's a sign of prestige. I mean, just like in your anatomy theater, I mean, it's becoming... So there is a new ambience that is crucial for understanding the emergence of a community. Yeah. And then if you go to the 18th century, of course, the last of the triumvirate that you talked about.
Yeah.
I mean, he wanted to leave Holland. He wanted to go to emigrate to England because he found that suddenly there is no room for him there, for what he wants to do. So there is a very interesting trajectory, I think, that adds dimension to the picture that you present that needs to be taken into account.
Yeah. But I think this is also closely related to the emergence of the mercantile aristocracy in the Dutch Republic. I don't know about other countries, but in Holland it was like that. There were so many merchants who did business with the Levant, who had business relations there, who were able to obtain manuscripts, who gave travel grants to scholars to go there. So it was in the air. You're absolutely right about that, yeah. But I think it has a lot to do with the economic position of the local elite. and their interest in Levantine trade or Southeast Asian trade.
Dirk van Wit.
Yeah, I also think it has something to do with the rise of biblical criticism and biblical scholarship in the 17th century. What you see is that, at the end of the 16th century, all of the Latin texts from antiquity were more or less available in print. At the end of the 16th century, the same is true for all the Greek language. So classical philology by then was almost entirely covered. You see this when the young Somers discovers a new manuscript of the Greek anthology, that he's wild about it. He's and everybody's very excited about these few scraps from Greek antiquity which suddenly are discovered. So so it was the basic thing was, what was the new thing you could actually do? And what you see in the early 17th century, I think, is that people like classical scholars transform themselves more and more into biblical scholars, because you didn't just have to know Latin and Greek, obviously, but also Hebrew, and preferably also Arabic or other fashionable stuff or exciting stuff such as Ethiopian or Syriac or whatever. And that would, with that, you could actually pose as the super scholar. If you wanted to be someone in the world of scholarship, you really had to know Arabic at least, but preferably also all the other languages, because that becomes the new thing if you really wanted to be at the top of philology. So, and that also makes me answer, you spoke in your talk a lot about sort of conflating the Netherlands and Leiden. So what was happening in other parts of the country? I mean, there weren't any chairs perhaps, but even at some of the, I know of the Amsterdam Athenaeum that, there was Hebrew being taught, and perhaps also some Arabic. I don't know what was going on at the other universities. Is this just in Franeker or in Utrecht or in Groningen or Harderwijk? Is this just a Leiden thing?
No. The Arabic was on the curriculum everywhere, I think, but it was always as part of the more general approach of Oriental languages. I think Leiden was unique in the way it devoted a special chair for Arabic, apart from the chair of Oriental languages, or apart from Hebrew. It was in other universities. Of course there was a lot of attention for Arabic, and it was also taught to the students, but always as part of a larger whole of Oriental languages, not especially Arabic. And that is why I chose. Well, I conflated with Leiden with Arabic studies in the Netherlands. But of course, it was everywhere.
Thank you so much for such a wide-ranging and stimulating talk. I was very interested in your ambivalence about the social utility of Arabic. On the one hand, it did much to make Arabic studies successful. On the other, you suggested that the scholars were at their best when they weren't being socially useful. So I wondered whether I could press you a bit on that.
Ooh, that is difficult. Yeah. It is difficult to look into their minds. And as I say, the reason they got their jobs was that the board of the university attached a certain importance to the teaching of Arabic. But the other one is just a kind of human development. If you take a certain interest in a subject, however abstruse, most people grow attached to this very subject. It's also that an increase of knowledge also increases your understanding of a foreign religion or whatever. I'm not really. I wouldn't like to make theories about it. It's a very simple approach, but I can only look at the facts and see that they really developed a genuine interest in the Arabs and Islam, and they also found out for themselves that the Arabs were no monsters, or were not fools, but intelligent and educated people like themselves, and this created a tie. Again, to mention Snooker Gonje, the late 19th century scholar, he claimed that there was talk about admitting Indonesian studies to Leiden to do a PhD thesis, and many people were opposed to it because they said, well, these natives are simply not intelligent enough to do a PhD thesis. And then he said, and I think he was right about that he said, the educated Javanese aristocracy is much more like us than the people you meet in the street every day in Leiden, the butchers and the manual workers and so forth. So this is really his way of see a kind of relationship or a bond between educated people versus non-educated people. It's a kind of class concept. And that also creates a tie. When you consider yourself to be an educated scholar and you read the work of a Muslim educated scholar, where you realize, well, he's one of us, versus the rest, the unskilled laborers, and they don't belong to, they're not us. Maybe something like that.
Maybe one last question from Simon Mills.
Well, thank you. In some ways, it's a continuation of Alex's question, but I'd just like to push a little bit more on this point that you made about the utility of Arabic, particularly for the early history of Arabic study at Leiden. Because my understanding, I'm thinking really of Gerald Toomer's book on England, where he makes the same point that Arabic...
Sorry, whose book?
Of Gerald Toomer's book on the study of Arabic in England, where he makes the point that it was always said that Arabic would be useful for the English trade in the Levant, but as I remember, the point that he makes was that this doesn't really have much effect on the course of Arabic studies in comparison with things like the theological argument or science. And I just wonder if you think it's a different circumstance in the Netherlands and that this does have more of an impact. And a closely related question to that is, does anybody suggest at this early stage that the study of Turkish would be useful? Because one would think if you were to go to Istanbul or Izmir for a diplomatic career, that would actually be more useful than Arabic.
It is the question of the utility, of the usefulness of Arabic is especially relevant in the first half of the 17th century and the early days of Dutch economic expansion. Arabic was already known in contrast with other languages such as Malay, Javanese, or Thai, or whatever. So they took it for granted that if you would go to Asia, that Arabic would help you on the way because they were Muslims. So there was a general awareness that knowing Arabic would help, and it was within your reach, and languages like Malay and Javanese were not, obviously. And you see that in the early 17th century that scholars actually translate documents into Arabic to be taken abroad with early Dutch expeditions to Southeast Asia. Scaliger did one, Rafalengius did a very nice one too, and all the Leiden professors did Arabic translation work for the States General in The Hague, for the local government. So there was an active demand for Arabic in those days. Throughout the centuries, I think the last Leiden professor who actually did translating work for the government was Haarmaker, and he lived in the 1820s. So it went on for a very long time. And Turkish was considered much less important, I think. There was only the idea that there were Muslims and that Arabic would be more respected than Turkish. And I think the Turks thought about it in the same way. But of course, if people went to the Levant and did business there in cities like Izmir or Istanbul, they always cooperated with local minorities, local Jews and Christians who did the translation work for them. They never brought their own interpreters, I think. Although Werner went to Istanbul in 1644, arriving about 9 months later. And for the first 10 years of his stay there in Istanbul, he worked as a dragoman for a local jeweler who was from Antwerp, from the southern Netherlands. So it really meant that you could make a living out of it. So, well, there is something in it. It was useful.
Well, there was something in your talk. I think there was a very brilliant start and a very nice discussion. Thank you very much, Arnoud, again. Yes. Thank you very much. I'd like to, introduce you to Asaf Ben Torf, please.